Hey folks, this is Vihar. I am one of the DevRel engineers at Appsmith. Today I'm super excited for our community call. We have our very own Shrikanth. You might have probably seen him answering some questions around self-hosting Appsmith on our Discord and some of our community calls. So Shri, where are you joining from, and could you also introduce yourself a bit for the community?
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hi, my name is Shrikant, all the way from South India here. Uh, so I've been with the Appsmith team, I think, close to 3 years now, predominantly working as a DevOps engineer, backend engineer, and and the person who stirs up trouble everywhere. But yeah,
Awesome. Awesome. Super excited to have you, Shri, here. I am joining from Hyderabad. Even I am based out of South India. So, folks who are joining the call, do let us know where you are joining from on the chat and say hello for the community. All right. So, today we'll be diving into our topic how we build and manage data sources on Appsmith. This is actually pretty interesting because this would be a useful resource for the community around how they could also contribute new data source integrations on Appsmith. So we have our Sri who will be answering most of your curious questions, and we'll also be deep diving around how we manage and maintain all the data sources on Appsmith. All right, Sri. So before we get into the topic, could you provide us some context for new users by explaining how a native data source integration work on Appsmith?
sure, sure. That sounds like a great starting point to this topic. Um, so I'm going to take a step back here. So when you look at a SaaS application like Appsmith or any other SaaS application that's running in a browser that has a backend and you interact with it to get your work done, etc., etc., they predominantly work like a CRUD app, right? There is data in there. You do something to sign up, log in. You do something to fetch your data. You do something to write data, make changes, updates, work, and get stuff done, basically. So predominantly, most of them end up being CRUD applications where they have APIs for creating data, reading data, updating data, deleting data, etc., to get the business as usual work done. But this is an interesting aspect where the AppSmith's integrations part does not fall under that umbrella, wherein it's not. So, for example, say you're trying to interact with a Postgres database of your own via AppSmith by building an application in AppSmith. That's not to say you don't create that Postgres database in Appsmith. You already have that database. Appsmith needs to integrate with your database and fetch data and apply whatever operations you need done. So in that sense, it's less of a CRUD layer, but more of a proxy, which is kind of a. I've always seen that as a slightly distinguishing factor in this feature, where Appsmith is not acting as a CRUD service layer, but it's acting as a proxy between you and your nice database. Um, and those proxies are what the integrations are. We have an integration for Postgres, which is essentially a proxy adapter to your Postgres database that you can hook into to run SQL queries on your Postgres database. We have a similar integration that acts as a proxy for Google Sheets, another integration that acts as a proxy for S3, etc., etc. That's a bird's eye view of how this thing works.
Got it. Understood. So far today we have more than 20 plus native integrations. Could you also, shed some light around, how we can connect with not non-native integrations? Like today we have APIs as one of the main provider. Can you also set some context for users around how they can connect with different data sources on Appsmith with APIs?
Yeah. Um, so I think what you mean by non-native integrations is one of those SaaS apps like Airtable,
Correct.
etc.
Correct.
But as opposed to native integrations is ones that are like Postgres, MySQL,
Correct.
MSSQL, etc.
Correct.
Um, I think the distinguishing factor between these two is the fact that these databases they provide their own native driver. So it's not just a bunch of API requests that are powering that integration, but it's an actual native driver that is provided by the database vendor. Like Postgres gives us a Postgres driver, MySQL gives us a MySQL driver, etc., etc. And we essentially piggyback on that. And create a consistent API on top of all of these. So for example, say we take MySQL, we pick the MySQL's official driver, whatever they have for it, and we build the Appsmith's proxy API on top of it. So this API stands as a front. when you run an SQL query that you want to run on top of a MySQL database, this proxy basically relies on the MySQL provided driver and let it do its magic. And once you get the data back or response back, you again do some validation checks, polish it up, freshen it up, and return it back to the client. Return it to the client so that the client, whatever bindings are relying on that, they get the information that they need. But that's the primary differentiating factor between such native integrations and non-native ones. That the driver is provided. Okay, either the driver is provided by the database vendor, but in some cases it's not, and we end up building something that's sort of like a driver, which is the case, for example, with Google Sheets integration.
Got it.
But it's essentially that.
Got it. Understood. All right. So what are some of your native data source integrations you have developed with the team, and how do you maintain them?
Uh, Personally, the ones I've been involved with have been Postgres way back in time. This was, I think, one of the first SQL integrations that we've had, and that was one of the ones I was involved with, and MySQL actually, Postgres and MySQL. So at the time, it turned out that okay, MySQL, we already have a existing integration with Postgres. How different can MySQL be? There is tables, there is SQL, there is relations, and sure, it's probably just copy pasting Postgres integration and switching the driver from Postgres to MySQL, right? You would think. But turns out there's a few significant differences that made that integration not as straightforward as we'd hoped for. Like for example, MySQL has different engines on how it stores the data on the underlying file system. And that influences what data types are supported, how the validation on these data types are applied. So one of the engines, I think, for one of the engines on MySQL, validations are just a facade. Like they don't actually validate the data when you're inserting, but instead, I think they produce a warning or something. It depends on how you tune your engine. So it's a lot more parametric than Postgres is, sorry to say this, but a little less predictable in that sense. But it's not to say that MySQL was hard to integrate with as opposed to Postgres. They had their individual challenges. But what ended up being a little surprising was that it's different enough from Postgres that we had to develop an integration. It's not just a copy paste. That was a little surprising to see. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes. So is there any data source integration that you are not involved building that?
Oh, lots, dude. I wasn't significantly involved in the development of, for example, Google Sheets. I was involved in the planning stage of it only. And then, for example, Redshift was one of the things I didn't get a chance to get involved with, and a few other the more recent ones. And ArangoDB, obviously, no chance of my involvement, of course.
Correct. Yeah, we'll get into ArangoDB much later on our call. But before that, could you show us like a quick demo of where exactly these native integrations live on Appsmith and how you can connect them on Appsmith?
Oh, absolutely. I'm gonna um, try and do a little screen share and show off a Postgres integration. Just as a context, maybe. Let me see how well this works out. Right.
All right. We can see your screen. Shri, can you zoom in a bit?
Yes. Let's see. Okay, not that. Oh boy. Okay. Holy shit. Okay. How do you zoom here? Okay. Really?
Just click on the collapse menu on the top right, and you'll see right next to your profile icon, you'll see zoom.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, a little bit more. Yeah, I think this should be fine. Thanks.
Awesome. So this is a new app that you build on Appsmith, right? This is a new app. It doesn't even have a name, etc. Now we're going to go to queries and data sources, there's also already a data source, but we're going to try and do it again anyway. So when I try to create a new data source, we'll get into what a data source is, what a query is, how they're semantically different, etc. I will just bear with me for a little while. So we're going to try and pick one of the sample databases we have here. So I'm going to choose users. This is a Postgres, as the icon shows that off. It's a Postgres database. So I'm going to go create a new query here across this one. And we have this quick start buttons. I'm going to just write the query for posterity. See that this is an SQL query with the Postgres database, and it shows up which data source we're running with, etc. I'm going to select start from users limit 10, right? So this is a standard SQL query, nothing special here. We're selecting from this called users, and we're just limiting that for 10 rows. I don't want to see like 500 rows here. And I'm going to hit the run button here. So now we see the results, right? Now we see the results here. What happened behind the scenes is basically, okay, there is this data source called users1. There is this query called query2. Okay, send this query to the backend and relate it with the users1 data source. And the backend's proxy integration that I talked about essentially picks up these pieces: the users1 database and the query2 SQL query. Picks up these two and sees the database information, like what's the host, what's the username, what's the password I need to connect to, establish a connection to it, and runs the SQL query, gets the resulting table of data that we see here, basically, and sends it back to the client as a big blob, as a big JSON blob, basically. And the client fills that out that it's a table. Let me show the table, or if you want to see it as a JSON, you can show it as a JSON, etc. That's the
Understood. Shri, could you also, quickly walk us through how this varies for different data sources? Because Postgres, it has its own configuration for us to connect with that database. Mongo has its own configuration. So could you just show, how users can connect to this native data integrations and how the UI varies?
all of that. Okay, so good question. Okay, so for Postgres, we see a big box, big text input box that you can insert any SQL query, right? And that works. That works fine for mostly SQL databases. That's fine. But when it comes to things like say Firebase, MongoDB, or one of those NoSQL databases, SQL doesn't make sense. So a big fat text box like this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. For example, if we try this same exercise with the movies database, which, as the icon indicates, is a MongoDB database, this one. We see the new data source, we do the same thing, we do new query, and now we get this fancy, let me just collapse this, fancy little UI. So it's not just a single text box, but we get this fancy UI. I say, okay, the operation I want to do is find documents or insert documents or update, delete, count, etc. I choose my operation as a part of a drop-down instead of writing an SQL query that starts off with select star or insert something or delete something. Instead of that, I make a choice here. So since the choice here is find documents, I need to enter a collection. I need to enter a JSON BSON query. Somebody uses BSON queries, and any sorting, any projection, any limit, etc. Not as part of an SQL query, but we choose them here one by one. So all of this changes if I change this to insert, right? It changes to, okay, I specify the collection and the document I want to insert. I don't see a query now. What's the document you want to insert? And that's it. There's nothing below. So depending on what I see here, the entire collection changes. What details I need to provide changes.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. But I'm pretty sure to get to this stage, there is like a lot of crazy things going behind the architecture, to get to this modular stage. We'll get into there. Cool. See, just curious. So, what are some of your favorite native data sources and why?
Oh, yeah, that's a scary loaded question.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to pick a favorite, obviously. But I'm gonna make this choice based on what kind of technical challenges we've had to go through when developing these. And in that sense, it's less of my personal favorite, but it's more of that was the most interesting. That were a little more interesting than the usual integrations we develop. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out Google Sheets, uh, which was an interesting case, and S3, which um, continues to be an interesting case.
Right.
Uh, in particular for Google Sheets, the differentiating factor is that it's not SQL database, but it is tabular, and people do end up having relations. I have a table in my Google Sheets on sheet one, which has a employee ID or something. And when you say employee ID, obviously it relates to something else. Excuse me, it relates to a department in another sheet in the same database in the same. I even end up calling it a database.
Got
Um,
it.
that's the kind of things that you operate in, and that's fine, and that's how they're supposed to be used. Predominantly because you can refer to other sheets values in Google Sheets, right? You can put in an equal to and refer to others, have references. That's how you're supposed to use Google Sheets. So it's not technically a relational database, but you tend to use it. So that's kind of an interesting
Understood.
case that we had to solve those challenges. Um,
Understood.
S3 because it's not essentially a database but a file object storage. So the entire paradigm shifts.
Right. Awesome. For me, if you ask this question, I would say Postgres, because I'm not a backend person. I couldn't go back, write APIs, the way I want to. So I just get the database onto the table, do all the formatting, do all the cleaning just with JavaScript and sorted. Like everything Appsmith takes care of it. So that would be my favorite, native data source integration.
Oh, I can reflect that sentiment. At some point, this becomes easy enough that, okay, I can put my backend brain aside and just use this.
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Cool, Sri. Now let's deep dive into the most favorite part, which is behind the scenes. So what's the process of building a native integration on Appsmith?
Oh, okay. Um, so I'll try to answer this question from a point of view of how the code part of this is
Mm-hmm.
built and what
Mm-hmm.
goes in on. Since
Mm-hmm.
you termed it as behind the scenes, I'm gonna jump into in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let me see if I have it open and I can maybe screen share.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I did. Okay, just give me a second. Okay, where did the share button go? Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me bring your screen. Yeah,
You
we
guys
can
can.
see your screen.
Yep. All right. So so you have action controller, and that's where this all starts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, no wait, this is a create action API. We should have there it is. This is the execute API. This is the action execution API.
Mm-hmm.
We have APIs for creating a data source. We created the movies database, users database, etc., etc. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but beyond that, uh, which is common, right? You want to create a data source, whether it's a Postgres data source, whether it's a MongoDB data source, etc. That API is predominantly the same. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, the host changes, the kind of details changes, perhaps, but it's
Mm-hmm.
fairly common. But
Mm-hmm.
the majority of the magic happens in the execute call when you actually execute a query against a particular data source. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and this is that API slash execute. This is where all that magic starts with, and uh, we're
Mm-hmm.
it predominantly just as you can see, it's just called one method. So we can just deep dive and dig into it. There's a bunch of things that this thing does. First part of it is just validation. Like, okay, you're trying to execute an action, you're trying to execute an SQL query or some other find command or whatever on MongoDB, or you're trying to execute an action
Correct.
basically.
Correct.
You have the permissions to execute that action. Are you trying to run an action on somebody else's application? Like, damn you. We are trying to find out those. some basic preliminary checks that, okay, this operation is A-okay to be run or not. We figure that part out first. If everything checks out, like, okay, this dude has the permission to do this, let's go ahead, let's jump in. The next part of this is, we can go into this core and just dig into this, but what's essentially happening is the next part of this is, okay, we actually are there. Actions for this one. This is the next major part of this. I think that's what it is. Basically, the next major part of this is to figure out the bindings. So, say for example, the SQL query you're running has a double brace binding in it. Trying to get a value from an input box of some sort, or trying to get the value from another query that's already run, or whatever. You have a whole bunch of binding, etc. So that's the next part we try to figure out. Okay, we have the bindings. Do we have the values for those bindings? What we need to replace with, etc. So if you see here, this API doesn't work with a JSON body. It works with a multi-part form data. So the payload that client sends for this is not JSON, unlike other API. Most of the APIs use JSON, but this one uses multi-part form data. Why is that? Why is that? This is okay. Why? I'll answer the why part. A little more context. So in the multi-part form data, that the payload that the client sends, each part in this multi-part contains the value for each binding. So for example, if you run an SQL query with no bindings at all, that means this multi-part will have only one part, which basically shares what query are we running, what data source do I want to run it again, etc., etc. Primary details. That's the only part that will be there. If you have one binding, which is fetching the value from an input box, for example, then the multi-part payload will have two parts. The initial part, which is common for everything, which contains the action ID, etc., and one other part which contains the value of this binding. So the reason why do we do this, why is this a multi-part as opposed to JSON like everything else, is so that these parts can then be files. So if you're trying to execute an action that uploads two files to an S3 data source, then this multi-part way of doing it becomes useful. So each file will be uploaded as each part, and it can be chunked and transferred in an efficient way, even if the file is large. So that's primarily why it's done this way.
Correct.
Right. So once that happens, the flow goes into individual plugin code. So we have these individual plugins, and this is where the actual magic happens. So for example, we have Postgres. I keep picking up Postgres as an example, but inside this we have this Postgres class deep inside. There it is. So here we have there it is, the parameterized. This is where it starts. Right. Execute parameterized is one function that does it in one fashion. There is an execute common as well, I think, which executes in a different fashion. And primary difference between these two is whether you have prepared statement turned on or off. So if you have prepared statement turned on, we need a prepared statement and process it that way. That's what execute parameterized does. But if prepared statement is not true, then we go back to execute common and we just do the execute common part.
Right.
But basically, that's how most of these plugins work. You extend the base plugin, and there's a few abstract functions that you need to implement, like common, execute, parameterized, etc., and your plugin is ready. That's
Understood.
I can go to something specific.
Understood. So now I get a sense of how the queries are called and executed, and also how we handle the additional stuff like bindings, parameters. But let's actually take a step back and try to understand the modularity, meaning like where exactly does all the code for these data sources reside. Say if a new user is coming onto our GitHub, where can he find all these native integrations, and in case if he wants to like create a new integration on Appsmith, like how can he get started? Can you like show us, where exactly the code is decided for this?
The answer is predominantly in the modules where we've just been through,
Mm-hmm.
but I get where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So let me do it this way. So if you go to, this will be even more, this will be even simpler.
Shri,
Wait,
are you sharing your screen?
I just realized. Yeah, sorry.
All right.
So here, if you go to the public Appsmith repository, right,
Mm-hmm.
that's a little daunting at first when I show it in IntelliJ, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But you go to the repository and it's a little more friendlier.
Mm-hmm.
GitHub is a little more friendlier.
Right. Right.
Uh, in the app folder, you have the server folder, which has an Appsmith plugins folder.
Mm-hmm.
Until there, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Mm-hmm.
And even beyond that, one folder for each different integration that we have.
Understood. Understood.
Actually, well, where it all starts. And if you open one of these, so say for example, I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off there, but just just another statement.
Yes.
If you go plugin, for example, there is SRC, and go to main, go to just wherever it directs you to. Right? Here, and you find this primary class. this is a this is a kind of class you'll find in excuse me, give me a second. This is the kind of structure you'll find in all of the plugins.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a single Mongo plugin, MySQL plugin, Google Sheet plugin, etc.java,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where find the plugin implementation,
Got
right?
it.
Class Mongo plugin extends based plugin, and you'll also find the execute common, there it
Mm-hmm.
is, execute common function and the execute parameterized
Mm-hmm.
function. So the first thing is that I'll encourage people to just look into the existing implementations and just look around, mess with it, play with it, try to build it, change something, see how it tunes.
Right.
Uh, that experience best teacher.
Right.
That's it.
Got it. All right. So that this leads to my next question. So today, Appsmith, as we all know, it's like more mature product to build internal tools. So I'm pretty sure with every integration there are also some test cases, some crazy testing involved. So could you also share a little bit about that?
Of course. Of course. Can't move forward without tests, obviously. Uh, right. So if that happens, if it happens that we have new integrations in the future from people, it'll have to accompany tests.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's obviously it's hard to put trust. Even not even someone else, like future us, next month us will be very reluctant to touch the code.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's already working, and I don't want to touch it. I just don't want to touch it.
Right.
It's that happens with me at least. I know people smarter than me still feel that way, but anyway. Um, Predominantly, the testing happens via test containers, which is a library more than anything else. And the way the tests work is, again, best way to explain this is with an example. So I'm going to pick an example of, say, MySQL, right? Again, so I go back all the way again.
Mm-hmm.
Say, for example, we want to test the MySQL integration to see, okay, are we still working?
Mm-hmm.
Make some changes in the plugin. Are we still working, etc.
Mm-hmm.
We invoke test containers. Okay, do test containers. Just bring up a MySQL container for me, and I will test by running a few actions, few SQL queries on that MySQL container,
Mm-hmm.
and expect this response. I don't get that response, then something is wrong with MySQL container, with the MySQL integration.
Got it.
Similarly, for all the other plugins, the Postgres plugins tests invoke a Postgres container
Mm-hmm.
and destroy it once the tests are done,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc. Most all of them use a container like that.
Understood. Awesome. So next, I'm gonna ask you developers' most favorite question. The complications when building new things on a platform. So when we are talking about like different data sources, I mean everything has its own drivers, everything has its own architecture. So what are some of the complications that you see, when you are building like, various data source integrations on Appsmith, and how do you handle them?
Okay. So your question is more around the challenges we face when you're actually in the technical development cycle of
Correct.
this.
Correct. So, so basically, Postgres has its own driver, and the way we connect to it is completely different when compared to Mongo. Like similarly, Mongo differs with Google Sheets. Google Sheets differs with S3. So, how do you handle them?
Okay. Okay. So I think it predominantly boils down to figuring out those differences well in advance.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you don't want to start developing an integration for MongoDB and figure out a month later that MongoDB is not an SQL database.
Right.
Well, that's a part of the example, but to give an idea,
Right.
you want to you want to lay the you want to get the map of the land.
Mm-hmm.
You want to get some sense of direction of where we are,
Mm-hmm.
where we need to get to, what are the paths to get there, etc., etc. You want to figure out how the data is structured in that in the source.
Mm-hmm.
You want to figure out how users expect to use that data, what kind of structure is the most comfortable way to do it, and then proceed with this.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I can actually give an example here where we didn't take the full idea of how this was going to be used, and the integration turned out to be a little underwhelming uh, with the DynamoDB integration.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, yes, DynamoDB integration. Uh, uh, so basic rundown example is how it works is this, right? So you're trying to query a particular collection in DynamoDB,
Mm-hmm.
and you get one document, for
Mm-hmm.
example, and that document has one field name, and its value is Shri, right? For example. Now, if you fetch that document using the native DynamoDB driver, what you get is an object with name as the key, and the value is not Shri. The value is another object that has the key called string whose value is string.
Right.
So DynamoDB is trying to be helpful in the sense that it gives you the data type also. So
Mm-hmm.
if it's a number, the key is number and the
Mm-hmm.
value is there.
Got it.
So, but which we figured, okay, DynamoDB thinks that's useful information, so users will also find it useful. So let's go ahead with that.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that it's not very useful. It's a very, very big hassle to
Mm-hmm.
get the actual value out. So you see a field called name, you expect the value next to it. You don't expect a nested object with string inside it and the value there.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly inaccurate example, but that's essentially what we had to deal with.
Understood.
Uh, we need to figure out not just how the source understands its data, but we need to understand how the users expect to use that data, and that will give us the best way to do this.
Understood. Got it. Sri, could you also talk about some of the challenges when building a data source from scratch? Because there is like different data types. There is like managing connections. Could you also share some thoughts around it?
Oh yeah, um, those are two very good primary thorns in the thorns under the rose. Um, So I'll just go over them in turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
So data types, that's a good point because data types change between SQL databases. You can
Right.
imagine the kind of differences they have
Mm-hmm.
between non-SQL
Mm-hmm.
databases, right? So for example, MongoDB, you figure, okay, MongoDB is JSON data store. You put in and get JSON documents.
Mm-hmm.
And how many data types does JSON have? Numbers, strings, booleans, null, bam.
Right.
Those are the primary data types, and that's it. You call it a day. But no, turns out MongoDB is a little more complex than that.
Mm-hmm.
They have support for dates, object IDs, and I think a couple of others in the more recent versions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's it's a little more elaborate than what you would expect. Uh, so that takes us to the next step. Okay, so we have a few additional data types, dates and times and object IDs. Sure, we'll take them into account. We'll build the integration with those. Sure, and we go ahead with that.
Mm-hmm.
But then turns out you would expect this. It turns out we want to use data from multiple different sources and work with them together,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there is a date time information coming from MongoDB. There is a date time information coming from Postgres, and you would think they behave the same, but no. Postgres has its own way of dealing with times and dates. MongoDB has its own way of dealing with times and dates. And don't even get me started on Google Sheets and Excel. But there's differences within date types itself among multiple data sources. Postgres has a way of storing data, dates and times with the time zone, without time zone, with a particular time zone, with a default time zone, which depends on how the server is configured, etc., etc. So it's a mess. And when you try to combine these date times coming from two different sources, and they're supposed to match, but they don't match, it can lead to a big fat rabbit hole. So those are the kind of things we want to figure out. And sometimes this behavior changes in the same database in versions. So yeah, those are the some of the kind of challenges with particularly with data types that yeah that we
Understood.
keep discovering.
Understood.
But the other one, sorry,
Yeah.
gone.
So
Okay.
I am just curious about one thing. So how well should know about that particular integration? Like for example, if I were to build a Postgres integration on Appsmith, how well I should know about Postgres.
Um, so there I would say, when you since you're starting the sentence with I want to build a Postgres integration, I would qualify that with an 80-20 rule.
Mm-hmm.
Don't try to cover all the documented data types
Right.
at your first go.
Mm-hmm.
No. Make an impact with 20% effort and cover 80% of the most used data types.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot more impactful.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the 80% most important data types that you can cover with your integration with only 20% effort? Covering all edge cases and all data types will be the remaining 80% effort.
Understood.
So share share a lot, share along before you're done with that 80%.
Mm-hmm.
When you have that 2080, share right away. Don't attempt to solve everything. When you have that 80% solution, that's where you take a step back, share it, share it with the community, see if it even solves that 80% problem. Maybe nobody cares about the rest of the 20%, all
Right.
the better.
Got it. All right. Go on. So you're talking about managing connections.
Right. So that's the other point you raised, which is managing connections to these databases, right? Which part of the problem is connections are defined differently when you're considering such a wide range of databases, right? The definition of a connection is pretty self-explanatory when you're talking about Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, etc. But what's a connection with, say, Google Sheets? How does that work? What's a connection with, say, S3? You want to upload a file, you uploaded a file, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need a persistent connection to it. So what's a connection there? It doesn't make sense. And yes, that would be accurate. It doesn't make sense. So only we keep connections where it makes sense only, right? So for example, Postgres, we keep a connection so that we can respond faster for the following queries. And for example, Google Sheets and S3, the ones I spoke about earlier, they don't need a connection. So we don't keep a connection. But in terms of Google Sheets, particularly, you need an API token to save so that you can talk to the user's Google Sheet.
Mm-hmm.
So that token acts like a password in the data source, like you're giving your Postgres password or something, but it still doesn't mean a persistent connection is saved. But that persistent token is indeed saved, like it's a password.
Got it.
Yeah.
Understood. So my next question would be, what does it take to maintain an existing integration on Appsmith? Like I think Postgres and Mongo have been our oldest native data source integration, and it's almost been like 3 years. I've literally seen all the change these two integration went through. But what does it take to actually maintain them?
We keep discovering novel cases, dude. We keep discovering it's just on one angle it's frustrating that we're not able to foresee that, but it's also fascinating how how creatively these integrations are used by people, and it's just, oh, why didn't we think of that? No, but it's fascinating to see. And one of the things that go into this is tests, test, and more tests, and then some more tests, because you can you can be as confident as you can in making the statement that okay, we work with Postgres 100%. Like we are rock solid stable with Postgres, and we are proud of it, right? You can be as confident as you can in making that statement. But come next month, Postgres comes up with a new version. Uh, they promise full backwards compatibility.
Right.
That's perfectly fine.
Right.
But our integration is doing something out of the ordinary, and our integration has a bug that we didn't notice in the old version of Postgres, but now we're noticing it.
Right.
Which is not to say Postgres has broken backwards compatibility. Like they've done for far longer than we have.
Mhm.
Huge respect. But this is where our expectations are broken, and we made some misaligned expectations, and so the integration breaks. And that's where tests come in. The tests will tell us, key, okay, the new version of Postgres, with the new version of Postgres, your integration code has a mess up here. Go fix it.
Mhm.
If we didn't have that test, however confident we were, we wouldn't know about that failure until some poor user comes complaining,
Mhm.
which is extremely unfortunate. We shouldn't be there.
Got it. Understood. So, Sri, how do you manage all the credentials, when you're working with these, integrations, the credentials, access changing, all that stuff?
Are you talking about credentials for users
Correct.
database or
Correct. Credentials for users database.
okay? Okay, good question, because that's a sensitive piece of information, right? Um, so this question, the underlying motivation for this question, I'm guessing, is how do we secure them? How do we keep them safe? How do they not get leaked out
Mhm.
into the wrong hands, right? So I'll put in a three-pronged answer to this. One, we encourage self-hosted. Two, they are encrypted in the database at rest. And three, they don't show up in the view mode at all. I have a very, very good habit of forgetting, so I just spelled out those three. Now I'm going to go into details a little bit.
Right.
So first is we encourage self-hosting, right? You want to build an app that connects to your database, and if that database is already in a private cloud, and you're not comfortable with exposing it to the internet so that Appsmith can connect to it, sure, so be it. One, we ask you to only whitelist Appsmith Productions IP address
Mhm.
so that Appsmith can connect to your database at least.
Mhm.
Uh, by that, we encourage you to self-host Appsmith in your private cloud itself
Mhm.
so that it has direct access to your database.
Mhm.
Uh, so even better, right? If someone, God forbid, if someone gets access to your database credentials, they also will need to get into your cloud uh, to make use of them. But that's a moderate scenario, excuse me. The other aspect of protecting is encrypting your credentials at rest, right?
Mhm.
So when you create a new data source, give us host, port, username, password, whole bunch of things. All of that is stored in the database, MongoDB Appsmith's MongoDB database, in plain text, except for the password. The password is encrypted using AES-256. The key is a combination of a salt and password, which are stored as environment variables. They are not stored in the same database. We don't put the key and the lock together. So if someone gets access to Appsmith's database and they takes a dump and runs away with it, they will only be able to see the encrypted password and make no sense of it. Um, the flip side of that is if in your self-hosted Appsmith, if you lose your salt and password, Appsmith will not be able to recover your database password,
Understood.
which is an unfortunate side effect, but it's something you have to live with for protection. Um, yeah, there it is. What was the third one?
Um,
What was the third one? um, holy, okay.
we'll we'll
I'm
we'll
really
get
sorry.
back there. We'll get back there. But now that you have also talked about, having it on the two sides, meaning the self-hosting part and the cloud part. Uh, do you think will there be any difference when building a native data source integration? Do you think we'll have to keep anything in mind, in case if you want to handle self-hosting part and cloud part?
Oh no, I don't think so. Unless it's a very specific, special, ad hoc, unbelievably special case, I shouldn't think so. Uh, it's because if I want to make the statement that it'll work on any self-hosted instance,
Mm-hmm.
oh, Prod is just another self-hosted instance. Cloud is just another self-hosted instance. We should be
Got
able
it.
to take.
Got it. I also have one more new question. I actually haven't tested it out on Appsmith, but how do you actually connect like a local, database? Say if I'm working on a Postgres database in my local machine, like how can I,
Hmm.
connect with Appsmith there?
Ah, like that. Okay. So unless Appsmith is also running as a self-hosted instance on your local laptop,
Mm-hmm.
Appsmith Cloud or something else obviously won't have access to
Mm-hmm.
stuff running on your system.
Mm-hmm.
Thank God for that. Uh, but there is a way to have it exposed, right? You can run something like ngrok, local tunnel, and a whole bunch of one of these whole bunch of services,
Mm-hmm.
and expose your database that's running on your system, and have Appsmith connect to that. So ngrok essentially acts as another proxying layer here, just like Appsmith.
Mm-hmm.
So your connections go from your client, your browser, to Appsmith, which connects to ngrok, which connects to the database back
Got
on your
it.
laptop, all the way back.
Got it.
But just caution here that this step makes your database exposed to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody with the right URL, with the right credentials, with the right access and information, they can access your database, and you know
Got it. Got it.
just a caution.
Got it. So sorry about going off topic, but moving forward, we have a few questions for the community that we want answers from your end. So could you describe your perspective on how users can request new native integrations from the Appsmith team?
Oh, GitHub. GitHub is the primary source of truth for this, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in fact, dude, we have a whole bunch of integration requests already.
Right.
Just give me a second. Right. We have a whole bunch of integration requests already. So probably what you're looking for is already there
Mm-hmm.
on GitHub as an issue. So
Mm-hmm.
I would just encourage you to encourage you to just search, find that issue, join in the discussion of how the integration is being built, your opinion, your voice, your style of how you intend to use it can and will likely influence how we build it. So so please join in. Like you're thinking of a new database that you want to use with Appsmith. If an issue doesn't exist, create it. If it exists, join in the conversation. Provide inputs. Yeah, I would say that's the starting point.
Got it. So as a person who is sitting behind the engineering team, how do you prioritize all these feature requests? How do you gather feedback? How do you brainstorm for a particular integration? So what's your process as soon as you see all these feature requests?
Um, okay, a brief answer to that would be to put it to try to place it on that quadrant
Mm-hmm.
where you say essentially to try to find the ones with low effort and high impact,
Mm-hmm.
right? Scale it up on impact and effort, and we want to pick the high impact, low effort ones
Mm-hmm.
first, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even before that, we want to figure out what's the impact and what's the effort, and that takes in a little R&D effort, wherein you want to figure out how is the data structured here. Like, is it an SQL? Is it JSON? Is it tabular but API access like Airtable, like Google Sheets? What authentication does it take to get into it? You want to figure out the kind of effort, right? The kind of the data that is there. How do you want to access it, etc. And then you try to model it and against one of the integrations that we already have, right? See if it's similar to one of the problems we've already solved, and try to, peg it against that.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is more than just to use existing experience, but the reason is more also on try to create a consistent experience, right? So say if it's a data, so say for example, we have Google Sheets integration, right? and say tomorrow we want to build integration with Office 365's Excel
Right.
offering,
Right.
right? Yeah, you would want that experience of using Office 365's Excel to be similar to Google Sheets,
Right.
right? I should have to relearn how to use Appsmith with Excel. Even if I know how to use Appsmith with Google Sheets, the experience should be similar. Otherwise, it'll feel like a different product. Like Appsmith, it should feel like a cohesive product. So that's the reason we try to peg it with something existing. And if we figure it out, then we have better estimate of effort and impact, and then we take it off from there.
Got it. Understood. So I have one more, curious question. As an open source enthusiast, and I'm pretty sure, people in the chat would also be wanting to listening to this question.
Oh yeah.
So how easy is it to develop a new integration on Appsmith if you are like a new open source contributor?
Oh man. Oh, it's damn easy. You just have to do ABCs. That's an answer I would love to have given. But the reality is it's a little more complicated than I wish it was. Um, and it's more complicated than it could have been, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't do it in any other way.
Mhm.
So I wish it were simpler, but I wouldn't change anything.
Mhm.
That's a that I'm conflicting with myself. I'm contradicting myself there. But the reason I say that is there is a because software maintenance is always harder than building software,
Correct.
right? Maintenance is always harder. And the reason integrations are the way they are today, the reason they are complex today, is because we want to maintain backwards compatibility, right? As we go on fixing things, as we go on improving things, you don't want to break what was already working. Like you figure out, okay, say for example, you figure out that Postgres has this new way of doing things, has the simpler way of doing things. We maybe didn't have to go through all that. You figure out something, a hypothetical example, but you figure out something like that. You don't want to do it, scrap everything and start from scratch. No. What is working yesterday should work today, should work tomorrow. That's the fundamental truth you don't want to deviate from. You can make the experience simpler, better, nicer, fancier for everybody coming in, and maybe you can do that for existing people also. But you may not provide the fanciness for existing users, but at least not break.
Mhm.
So less fancy is fine, breaking is not fine.
Right.
So in order to give that promise, integrations are a little more complicated than maybe if we started from scratch. They'd be a lot cleaner, a lot simpler, etc.
Mhm.
Having said all that, uh, if you want to build a new integration, there is one Java interface that you need to implement, which is a base plugin. And as long as you implement all the methods that are there, you have your integration ready.
Mhm.
That's the one-line answer to this question.
Got it. But I think for seasoned developers, looking at the existing modular architecture that we have, it would be like super easy because one example is ArangoDB.
Mm.
We have a contributor from our community, and he like literally wrote all the core code for ArangoDB. So, what were your thoughts? I mean, were you excited that a complete whole new integration was coming from the community, and what were you thinking at the time?
Oh, I was thinking, what? That's the there were two parallel thoughts going on, and oh, whoa, this is incredible. Now we have our first integration contribution from the community.
Mhm.
And the other thought was, okay, that's an interesting way to learn the existence of ArangoDB.
Mhm.
Uh, not to downplay their efforts, but you know, I heard like, okay, I'm glad this came from the community, right?
Mhm.
We have poor understanding of ArangoDB at the time, and we're glad that the user needed integration with ArangoDB. It also speaks to how much they loved Appsmith as a product, right? I I will go through the effort of building an integration with ArangoDB on Appsmith, even though there is very little documentation on how to do it, etc. I will still go through that effort because I love Appsmith, the product, so much, and I want to work with my ArangoDB via Appsmith. That's the kind of uh, that's the kind of love that it speaks out of. Like, because obviously it's not a 5-minute job. Like,
Right.
no, they put in some serious effort in developing that. Like, huge respect to that, and love.
Got it. I'm hoping to see crazy more integrations are coming right after this call. All right. So folks in the chat, we'll be closing the call in 5 to 10 minutes. So in case if there are any questions, feel free to post it on the chat, and we are happy to answer them. All right. So now that we have talked about architecture, Sheep, are there any plans to improve, the existing architecture, especially when we are, talking about how we structure and organize all our, native data source integration. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, your question is around, are we improving the architecture and structure of how the integrations are used from Appsmith's UI, or they're built on a
Built, how
technology?
they are like built
How
from,
they,
yeah.
okay. Okay. Uh, yes, of course, there is always room for improvement. And the short answer to that is yes, of course, we'll keep on improving. Um, but again, like I said before, the underlying principle of growing there is not break existing stuff, right? Uh, you can improve all you want, you can re-architect all you want, you can make it fancier all you want, but if it's going to break existing integrations, and if it deems that we have to go back to all our existing users and ask them to, okay, delete that data source and recreate it because we made some changes in our architecture.
Mhm.
I think no, that's not going to fly. Existing integrations should work. And as long as that principle is true, we do want to make it simpler, more approachable, easier, etc. Sure, that helps community members to come and contribute um, better, sure, but it also makes debugging, developing, testing, and all of that easier within Appsmith's team. So there is value in that all around. Um,
Got
so
it.
yes.
Got it. All right, Shri. I have one more last question, and this is from Joseph, who is also one of our DevRel. Unfortunately, he couldn't come onto this call, but he has this question. So, do you think the platform will evolve to a state where users can create their own SaaS plugins to use on their self-hosted instance, or maybe submit those plugins to be added to the core product?
Okay. I opinion, but I think yes. Uh, I think yes, we will. Hopefully, we will get to that point.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe I don't honestly know. This is I don't know. This is an opinion, but I'm fairly certain we will want to get to that point where I mean that's so when I was showing the code of how these plugins are written and built, etc. You notice that each plugin is a separate module, a separate folder, self-contained within itself.
Mhm.
Right? There's no abstraction leak there, and that means it's always possible to add a new folder there and have that integration be right? We're not there yet. It's a little more nuanced than that, but it speaks to that direction. We want to get to that point
Correct.
where adding a new integration is just adding a folder with magic in it. But yes.
Got it. I think that's all for this call. Shri, thanks a lot for taking your time out and share all your knowledge around the native data sources and Appsmith. So, folks, the recording will be available on YouTube. So, in case if you have any other questions, feel free to post it on our Discord. We'll also drop you the link where you can join our Discord. But that's all for today. Thanks a lot, Shri. I'm looking forward to host you again. With some more core concepts around Appsmith.
Thank you, people. Thank you, everybody. So,
All right, see you
see you
guys.
guys.
Bye.